The Godfather is a crime novel published in 1969 and written by Mario Puzo. It concerns a fictional mafia crime family run by Don Vito Corleone and charts the rise of Don Vito as a powerhouse in the criminal underworld, becoming one of the heads of the so-called 5 New York crime families, and it also covers the eventual takeover of the family by Vito's son Michael. The book was an absolute smash hit, remaining on the New York Times bestsellers list for 67 weeks and selling over 9 million copies in just 2 years. The Godfather, of course, was also very famously adapted into a feature-length movie directed by Francis Ford Coppola and starring Marlon Brando in the lead role, alongside Al Pacino, James Caan and Robert Duvall. The movie is considered one of the best ever made, alongside the sequel that was released just 2 years later. Together, they won 9 Oscars, although the third film, released over a decade later in 1990, received mixed reviews. The novel is quite a mammoth read. It had something like 500 to 600 pages, although the letters were quite big, so I guess it isn't that long. I'm a very slow reader, and yet I finished the book in less than a week, partly due to being ill and bedridden and thus undisturbed by pesky children and family members. But even if that wasn't the case, it would be a difficult task for anyone to rip the pages out of my hand, because I was so into it. It was like I was addicted, even though I pretty much knew what was going to happen. Having seen the movie, my eyes were glued to the pages, and it's very much due to Puzo's accessible but seductive writing style. He really has a way with his words, making you sit and ponder with just a sentence worth of words, getting you into the minds of his characters and embracing and empathizing with their predicaments and issues, even if these issues might seem small and distractions from the main story. One of the interesting things Puzo did in the novel was give us a shocking event at the end of a chapter, brazenly and without warning, making us think, how the hell did that happen? And then the next chapter would detail how this event came to be in place, usually from a different character's point of view. And because we know where it's going, we know where this chapter is headed, every mundane detail, even if it's a character getting dressed in the morning, is filled with suspense. Now I know that as a lot of my subscribers are fans of gangster movies, and most would have already seen the Godfather films, one of the questions I'm going to get by reviewing the book is, what are the differences between the book and the film? Are they similar or different? So let's talk a bit about this. So I found that the movie was pretty faithful to the book. It followed it with obedience, down to entire pages of dialogue at times, and even minor scenes like near the beginning where Clemenza tells Paulie to get him a drink at the wedding, little scenes like that. And that makes sense, doesn't it? After all, Mario Puzo, the book author, also helped Francis Ford Coppola write the screenplay for all 3 movies. But there are some differences though, some small key differences. Like I was surprised with how Kay ended up, for example, the wife of Michael Corleone. I always heard that the first 2 Godfather movies are derived from the book, and the third was made up by Puzo and Coppola after Paramount wanted them to work on a third movie. That's about 90% true, I'd say. If we ignore the structure and the timeline of the book, which is different from the films, most of the events in the first 2 films are in the book, especially in the first one. The flashback timeline in The Godfather Part 2, showing the rise of Vito, is also in it. However, pretty much none of the Michael Corleone timeline from The Godfather Part 2 is in the book. So while Michael does eventually move the family to Las Vegas, which happens in the first film anyway, there's no attempted hit on Michael at his home, no Hyman Roth, Fredo's betrayal, none of that. Fredo is hardly in it, in fact. I was quite surprised at that. I always assumed that Michael's business ventures after the 5 family hit was in the book, but it isn't. And because of this, the novel is very much focused primarily on Vito Corleone as its prime subject. I wouldn't say there were major differences between the first film and the book. The only real differences are the omissions from the film. There's entire chunks of the book that don't make it into the movie, and for the most part, these were the correct decisions on the part of the filmmakers. This is a big book, with loads of interesting characters and an interesting story, but there's also quite a bit of fluff in it, chapters where we follow characters who aren't integral to the main plot and who aren't really that interesting. Like for example, we follow a woman who Sonny has an affair with, who apparently has such a huge vagina that no man can satisfy her, aside from Sonny, who's hung like a horse. After his death, she gets depressed and eventually sparks a romance with a surgeon who is able to perform a procedure to tighten her walls so she can have hanky-panky and have fun doing it. Speaking of hanky-panky, there's a lot of that in the book, a lot. Like, Puzo was really horny when he wrote it and didn't miss a chance to describe people getting some action. There's also a lot of pages dedicated to the actor and singer Johnny Fontaine. Legend has it he's based on Frank Sinatra. And there's a lot of chapters following his martial issues, his sexual exploits in Hollywood, him coming to terms with losing his voice, and other stuff. He's a much more prominent character in the book than he is in the film. But unfortunately, like the vagina woman, he just really isn't that very interesting, especially compared to some of the principal characters. Aside from that, much of the other omissions concerns the details and backstories of characters who we don't know much about from the films. And these parts of the book are interesting, very interesting. Like, we get a horrific story about the legendary enforcer Luca Brasi, Don Corleone's much feared right-hand man, who even made the Don himself nervous, according to the book. Other characters like the bodyguard Al Neri are also expanded upon. And if you're interested in the backstory of characters like these, then hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so, because I'll be making videos on them soon. Some of the main characters are a lot more complex as well. I was pleased that Sonny Corleone, the eldest of the Corleone brothers, was a lot more layered in the book than he was in the movie. He's still hot-headed and high-tempered, and his journey and end is still the same, but I found it interesting that he was very much highly regarded and feared by the 5 New York families, and a perfect frontman in a mob war. He was also self-aware in the book, knowing he could never be like his father and actively attempting to keep his temper in check. The most injustice in the films can perhaps be attributed to Tom Hagan, the consigliere of Don Corleone, who was taken in by the family after living in the streets after escaping an orphanage. We learn so much about Tom. We are in his head for large chunks of the book, seeing the way his mind works, feeling the pangs of jealousy he feels when the blood brothers express such love with each other, and him always being something of an outsider, being adopted, and also, of course, not being Sicilian. We learn about his inferiority complex and him wanting to prove himself as the only non-Sicilian consigliere, and also his guilt and remorse after Sonny's death, knowing he was at least partly at fault for not having the foresight to anticipate a trap from the Corleone family's enemies, mistakenly thinking recent lack of attacks are because the opposition is about to make a peace deal. Hagan is usually in the background in the films, and it's extra frustrating to know that he was originally going to have a big role in the third film, with him and Michael Corleone turning against each other and fighting for control of the family. This could have brought about so much of the subtext from the book, the concealed feelings of Tom Hagan, which were really not in the films. But of course, Robert Duvall ended up not being in the third film, and the story was rewritten. In fact, I could actually argue that Tom Hagan is the closest thing to a protagonist in the novel, at least for the first third or so. The book's main character is Don Corleone, but we read more about him than read through him. In fact, most of what we know about him we learn from Tom Hagan, as Tom thinks to himself in his head. And Michael Corleone, the other contender for main character, disappears for huge chunks of the book, and again, we don't get as much insight into what is going on inside his head as much as we do of Hagan. That being said, there's more detail in the book regarding Michael's time in Sicily, and how he came to understand the culture of the Mafia and how he began to sympathize with its efforts to provide protection for people from the corrupt government and police, which makes his transition as someone who didn't want anything to do with the Mafia to becoming the Don of his family much more something that you can slowly see coming about, as opposed to the film where it's more a case of, whoa, where did he come from? One thing that the book does is that it makes me appreciate the acting in The Godfather even more than I already did. There's passages that describe little nuances, minor facial expressions or glances that characters make, or certain atmospheres that characters emit. And the actors in the film absolutely nailed it. Brando in particular, they really captured the essence of the characters, and you have to give credit to who cast the actors as well, because they fit so perfectly with how the characters are described in the book. which is all the more surprising when you consider some of the casting of The Godfather was last minute, some were despised by the studio, and some of the actors were actual mobsters. It is an excellent book, absolutely fantastic and such an easy read. It is not diluted by having seen the films, rather the book and the movies complement each other well. The book, as mentioned, used interesting narrative techniques that keep things exciting, that can only really be done in books. And the movie, of course, has elements like the acting and the music that are top tier in that medium. The book's legacy is so self-explanatory, there's little point in me listing out all the great things about it, hence why I didn't do much of that in this review. But The Godfather is such a cornerstone of modern American crime literature, it's difficult to even comprehend its influence or articulate its status as a masterpiece. It tells an epic story which is a kind of perverted inverse of the American dream, that garnishes fiction with historical fact, and at the same time is intimate and personal, despite being as easy to read as a Harry Potter book. An incredible work. Thanks for watching.